TikTok has closed a deal to keep the wildly popular video sharing app used by more than 1 billion people worldwide available in the U.S. The agreement caps a 6-year legal and geopolitical fight.
In March 2026, the Wall Street Journal reported that investors in the new TikTok deal would pay roughly $10 billion to the United States Treasury, reportedly as a condition of the deal that allowed an app to keep operating in the United States, the same government that had spent years demanding it divest from Chinese control or face a ban. I want to read you something from nearly 6 years earlier, August 3rd, 2020, White House press briefing. A reporter asks Donald Trump about a potential TikTok sale. Trump says, "A very substantial portion of the sale price should go to the United States Treasury." I don't know what you call that, but I know what he called it in 2020. Before we go any further, I need you to sit with one number: 170 million Americans. That is the figure the Supreme Court of the United States cited in its official opinion about this case. TikTok itself had put that number on record, and the court repeated it back. To put that in human terms, that is more people than live in most individual countries in Europe. And that figure is from 2024. By the time the new ownership structure was finalized in January 2026, the platform's own announcement said the number had grown more Americans than that, and 7.5 million businesses alongside them. At that scale, the word app starts doing dishonest work. We use it because it's convenient. But an app is something you delete when you run out of storage. What TikTok had become, by any serious measure, was closer to infrastructure, the kind of thing that leaves a mark when it disappears. The advertising industry understood this before most politicians did. Analysts estimated that TikTok generated roughly $10 billion in US advertising revenue in 2024 alone. If the platform went dark, analysts estimated that somewhere between $6 and $8.5 billion in US advertising spend could redirect to rivals, to Meta, to Google, to Snap rapidly and by the billions, which is why what the Supreme Court wrote deserves more attention than it received. In January 2025, the Supreme Court upheld the law, a divest or ban statute that would have prohibited TikTok from operating in the United States unless ByteDance severed its control of US operations. And in that same opinion, they put this sentence on the record: "There is no doubt that, for more than 170 million Americans, TikTok offers a distinctive and expansive outlet. They acknowledged what the platform was, and then they let the law stand anyway." I've thought about that sentence a lot, not because the court was wrong, but because of what it reveals about how Washington was thinking about TikTok by the end, not as a product that could simply be switched off, but as something that had to be managed, redesigned, placed under different ownership, controlled rather than eliminated. We spent 6 years arguing about the data, whether it was safe, whether it was being accessed, whether American servers were enough. That was a real debate, but I don't think it was the load-bearing one. The more consequential question, the one that the last 6 years actually answered, was not about the data alone. It was about who gets to decide who owns a platform used by 170 million Americans, through what process, with what leverage, and at what price. In April 2024, President Biden signed the ban law. 2 weeks later, TikTok filed a lawsuit to block it. TikTok told the court that by the time Congress passed this law, the company had spent more than $2 billion. Not on marketing, not on growth, on compliance. On building the specific security infrastructure that US government officials had, at various points, described as the path toward addressing their concerns. $2 billion to build what Washington said it needed. And that's not the detail. The detail is what else was in that filing. TikTok told the court that it had negotiated a 90-page draft agreement with the US government's National Security Committee. 90 pages with financial penalties for violations, monitoring mechanisms, and a provision that would have given US authorities a shutdown option, the ability to take the platform offline under the agreement's terms. A kill switch, negotiated, written into a draft, an unfinished settlement but real enough to put on the record. Shou, TikTok CEO, had spent years building toward this moment. A draft agreement that would, on paper, address the security concerns Washington had raised. The architecture was real, the penalties were real, the shutdown option was in the draft. Congress passed the ban law anyway. TikTok's response in the filing was a single sentence: Congress tossed this tailored agreement aside. We spent 6 years debating the data, whether it was safe, whether American servers were sufficient, whether the engineers in China could still see it. That debate was real, but I don't think it was the one that mattered most. The one that mattered, the one that the last 6 years actually resolved, was not about where the data lived alone. It was about who owned the platform. And those are not the same question. November 2017. A company called ByteDance signed an agreement to acquire Musical.ly, a lip-sync app and major youth platform with a heavily US user base. If you weren't following the tech industry that week, you missed it. It didn't register as a geopolitical event. It looked like one company buying another company. That was all it looked like. What CFIUS, the US government's Foreign Investment Review Committee, would eventually open as a national security file was this acquisition. A Chinese company taking ownership of a major US youth platform, their data, their behavioral patterns, their attention. At the time, no formal review was triggered. Less than a year later, Musical.ly became TikTok. Its substantial US user base transferred under a single rebranding into a Chinese-owned platform. The national security framing hadn't arrived yet. The national security framing came in August 2020, when Trump signed an executive order calling TikTok a platform that automatically captures vast swaths of information from its users. A separate order directed ByteDance to divest what it had acquired from Musical.ly 3 years earlier. And on August 3rd, 3 days before the executive order, Trump said, "The thing I want you to keep in your back pocket." A very substantial portion of the sale price should go to the United States Treasury. Remember that. We'll come back to it. TikTok's initial response was not to fold to the framing, and not yet to fight it in court. It was to build around it. Through 2022, the company constructed what it called Project Texas, a dedicated US security organization, a new governance structure, and a migration of all US user traffic to Oracle servers on American soil. By June of that year, TikTok was announcing a first major milestone. All US user traffic was now being routed through Oracle Cloud infrastructure. This was what Washington said it wanted. Then, on the same day TikTok made that announcement, the same day BuzzFeed News published leaked audio from 80 internal company meetings. In those recordings, employees based in China discussed accessing US user data, not hypothetically, repeatedly. The architecture designed to address exactly that concern was reaching its first milestone on the same morning that evidence of its incomplete effectiveness was being published. I want you to sit with that timing for a moment. TikTok's own documents from that period acknowledged, in careful language, that engineers around the world, including those based in China, might need what the company called role-based access to certain data for technical work. In plain terms, the people building and maintaining the platform might need role-based access to certain data for engineering functions, and that access could extend across geographies subject to controls. That gap between where the data lived and who could reach it was the gap that sharply complicated TikTok's localization argument. December 2022. ByteDance admitted that employees had improperly accessed TikTok data belonging to journalists, specific journalists. The employees had been trying to identify the sources of news leaks. They used their access to TikTok systems to do it. ByteDance confirmed the access had occurred. All of that may be true. What it did to TikTok's position in Washington was not something a press statement could repair. March 23, 2023, Washington, D.C. Shou sat before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He had been TikTok's CEO since 2021, appointed precisely as this crisis was becoming the defining fact of the company's existence. And he came prepared. He opened with what had become TikTok's public argument: American data stored on American soil, a commitment to US-based infrastructure, US, oversight and controlled access. And then he said something that I think got less attention than it deserved. We spent $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion. On the security infrastructure the committee was asking about. The room's response was not engagement with what had been built. It was not a technical counter-argument. It was, by most accounts, a hearing that did little to change minds already made. The problem was ownership. And here is the thing about ownership that no amount of engineering resolves. Architecture is something you build. Ownership is something you are. TikTok could move its data to 1,000 American servers and sign 1,000 security agreements. But as long as ByteDance held the company, Washington could always say, "We don't trust who you are, not what you've built." I'm not sure I would have seen that coming either. And I'm not sure Shou did when he sat down in that room with his answers prepared and his first milestone complete. March 2024. Representatives Mike Gallagher and Raja Krishnamurthy, co-leading the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, introduced a bill with a simple premise: ByteDance had to divest TikTok, or TikTok would be prohibited from operating in the United States. Gallagher did not frame this as speech regulation. He described it in simpler terms: break up with the Chinese Communist Party. The bill passed the House 352 to 65. That vote margin matters. 352 to 65 is not a partisan split. It is a statement of near consensus. Whatever Washington's disagreements in that era, and there were many on this question, a bipartisan majority was aligned. April 24, 2024. President Biden signed the bill into law. ByteDance now had a legal deadline to divest from TikTok or face a ban. 13 days later, TikTok sued. I want to focus on one thing: that filing revealed not the legal argument, but a specific detail that changes how you understand the whole story. TikTok revealed in that filing that it had negotiated a 90-page draft national security agreement with CFIUS, the US government's Foreign Investment Review Committee, a draft document with independent inspectors and controlled access provisions, with technical safeguards, and with something else, something TikTok's legal team described plainly: a shutdown option. Negotiated, written into a draft document, an unfinished settlement but detailed enough to be on the record. Congress, the filing said, toss this tailored agreement aside. Sit with that for a moment, not the legal claim, but the situation it describes. Shou had spent years working toward exactly this position. The draft included not just extraordinary financial penalties for violations. It included a government shutdown option, the ability to take the platform offline entirely. And Congress, looking at the same proposal, passed a ban law instead. You can read that two ways. One reading: the security concerns were genuine and a negotiated agreement, however detailed, was never going to be sufficient because the structural issue was ownership, not architecture. The other reading: the draft agreement was a viable path and it was abandoned anyway. TikTok's filing argued the second reading, that Congress had skipped a less restrictive alternative that already included a government shutdown option. The US Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit disagreed. So did the Supreme Court in January 2025. Legally, the government's position held. But I want to stay with what TikTok's position tells us because it matters for understanding what happens next. TikTok did not sue as a company that had refused to cooperate. It sued as a company that had built the infrastructure Washington asked for, negotiated the agreement Washington asked for, and then watched Congress pass a ban anyway. That is a distinction. You can comply with a law, you cannot comply your way into being trusted. And trust specifically, the question of who should be trusted to own this platform and what that ownership should cost is the question that Part 5 answers. January 18, 2025, TikTok went dark. Not for one person, not for one region, for all of its users across the US. Opened the app and found a message saying the service was temporarily unavailable. The Supreme Court had upheld the law the day before on January 17th. The deadline was January 19th. Briefly, for roughly a day, TikTok was gone. Then it came back. January 20th, 2025. Donald Trump signed an executive order directing the Department of Justice not to enforce the ban for 75 days. TikTok had already been restored after Trump promised that delay before the executive order was even formalized. There is a word that would come to define how Trump publicly described what happened saving. And by the end of this section, I think you'll have a specific opinion about what it means. Over the months that followed, negotiations continued. A new ownership structure was being assembled, one that would, theoretically, satisfy both the law and the platform's continued operation. After a series of enforcement extensions through 2025, Trump signed what became the defining executive order on September 25th. Its title was Saving TikTok While Protecting National Security. On January 22nd, 2026, the deal was finalized. Trump posted, "I am so happy to have helped in saving TikTok." The new entity was called TikTok Joint Venture LLC, a company co-owned by American and allied investors who would hold a controlling majority, with ByteDance retaining a 19.9% stake. That 19.9% is a specific number. ByteDance retains meaningful economic interest in the platform while ceding majority control to US and allied hands, which together hold 80.1%. I want you to hold that detail. The financial terms of the deal were not part of the initial public announcement. The financial structure, who paid what to whom and on what terms, was not disclosed when the joint venture was announced. What the public received was a statement from the joint venture's website. Interoperability enables the joint venture to provide US users with a global TikTok experience, which tells you almost nothing. The fuller picture came in pieces. Oracle, one of the key American partners, disclosed a 15% stake in the joint venture in an SEC 10-Q quarterly filing. The disclosure described Oracle's investment as non-marketable, a form of equity that cannot be freely traded on the open market. Then, on March 13, 2026, the Wall Street Journal reported something that had not been publicly disclosed. The US Treasury was set to receive approximately $10 billion from the deal. Of that, a reported portion had already been transferred, $10 billion, to the US Treasury, as a condition of the deal that allowed TikTok to continue operating in the United States. 4 days later, Senator Mark Warner wrote a letter. Warner had been one of the most persistent voices in Congress on TikTok and foreign technology risk. He was not a newcomer to this issue. And after the Wall Street Journal report, he wrote to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and asked for an explanation of the deal's terms. His letter described the arrangement as PAC, uncompetitive, and ad hoc, and then he wrote a phrase that I keep returning to. This arrangement, if true, raises serious questions. If true, a sitting United States senator describing a completed transaction involving a platform used by 170 million Americans and a reported $10 billion payment to the US Treasury used the phrase, if true, because the financial terms had not been made public. There is something I keep coming back to. On January 19, 2025, the divest or ban law took effect. By January 20th, the app was back after Trump promised an enforcement delay that preceded the formal executive order. And in the gap between those two moments, somewhere between a Supreme Court ruling and an executive order millions of Americans experienced, briefly, what it looks like when a government enforces a decision about a platform and then suspends that enforcement before the next day is over. That gap is where this story actually lives. I've been thinking about what to call what happened here. Was this corruption? Was it extortion? Was it negotiation? Was it governance? I'm not sure those words are mutually exclusive anymore. What I can say is this. TikTok spent years building what Washington said it needed. It built the infrastructure Washington asked for. It negotiated a draft national security agreement with CFIUS. It brought in independent inspectors. It proposed the shutdown option. It spent, by its own count, $1.5 billion on the compliance architecture. And at the end of all of that, after the lawsuit, the blackout, and the deal, the outcome looks like this: a platform still operating, a foreign parent retaining 19.9%, and a reported $10 billion being paid to the US Treasury in installments, if the reporting is accurate. The thing about a compliance trap is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't know you're in one until you've already met requirement after requirement, only to find that meeting them wasn't the deciding factor. The deciding factor was always what came after, who held the leverage, and what they chose to do with it. TikTok's experience is a specific case of a more general pattern. When a platform is large enough and embedded enough, the government's power over it stops being purely regulatory. It becomes something closer to structural. Not we will fine you, not we will regulate you. We will decide whether you exist in this form, under this ownership. That is a different kind of power. And it does not require corruption to operate. It requires only size and patience, and the right political moment. There is a word I haven't used in this video: unprecedented. I've avoided it because I'm not sure it's accurate. What happened to TikTok, a foreign-owned platform pressured into a restructuring, and, if the reported fee is accurate, one that benefited the US? Government financially may be new in its specific form, but the shape of it is not entirely unfamiliar. It is the shape of what happens when something becomes too large to ignore and too embedded to simply remove. The question that doesn't have a clean answer, the one I've been sitting with, is simpler than it appears. If a government can condition a platform's existence on a financial payment to its own treasury, what exactly is that condition? Is it a fine, a fee, a tax, a toll? Or is it something that doesn't yet have a stable name, because the thing it describes is new enough that the language hasn't caught up? I don't have a verdict on this story. I'm not sure a verdict is what this story calls for. What I have is a sequence of events. A man said the Treasury should get a substantial proportion. Years passed. Compliance happened. Courts ruled. An app went dark for roughly a day. Trump promised a delay, and the app came back before the law's deadline had fully passed. A deal was finalized. A number was reported. And somewhere in that sequence, between the 2020 press briefing and the 2026 joint venture announcement, a line was crossed that I don't think we've fully named yet. TikTok is still on your phone. The question worth sitting with isn't whether that's good or bad. It's whether anyone in Washington, in Beijing, in the boardrooms involved was ever really asking a different question.